In pleasure or pain, come loss or come gain, be praised or be blamed, I remain just the same. For nothing and no one is mine, for anger nor pride have I time. I seek God alone, only thee. In thy love and thy joy I am free. I seek God alone, only thee. In thy love and thy joy I am free. I am strong in myself, I am free. Hello friends, Nayaswami Hriman here, broadcasting to you live from the Camino Hermitage on Camino Island, Washington. I have an interesting reading for you, selected from the unpublished Writings of Paramhansa Yogananda. If I were to read the whole thing, literally without comment, I think you'd find it rather shocking. So I'm not going to do that to you, but I'm going to talk to you about, read excerpts from an interview in February 1934, an interview with Paramhansa Yogananda, who is known as Swami Yogananda then, an interview on politics. Oh boy. Now, the Great Depression had started. The Society of America, if not other countries, but America was in something of a panic, a downward spiral. The FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected for his first term in 1933, I think it was. And then 3 months later in June, he passed what was called the National Recovery Administration Act, unfortunately dubbed NRA, but anyway, which was a concatenation of business and labor in an effort to resuscitate the United States economy. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1935 threw out the whole thing because it infringed on states' rights beyond interstate commerce and was growing increasingly unpopular with people because it was a top-down administrative attempt to run the economy, and it just got messier and messier. But I'd like to read to you this interview with Paramhansa Yogananda. Question: what message has Hindu philosophy offer towards solving present-day problems of peace between nations and averting international disasters? Well, then Yogananda goes on to talk about Mahatma Gandhi. Now, this was 1934, a great many years still, 13, 14 years before India's independence, an entire world war to go through. But nonetheless, he was popular even in America by then. And Yogananda comments that Gandhi has accomplished more in just a few years than Ireland has accomplished towards its independence in 750 years of armed resistance. I don't know about the facts in the case, but it's an interesting comment. He goes on to say that since our power of destruction is greater than our power of construction, the nations of the earth must find new ways to settle their differences, and that Gandhi is showing the way. He makes the claim that in America, prohibition could not be enforced by machine guns, yet by love, Gandhi has made over 60% of the people of India stop drinking. I've never heard that claim made before, and India isn't particularly known as a nation of alcoholic imbibers, but anyway, that's what he wrote. And if that's just the beginning of things he wrote, that would be shocking to people today coming from Yogananda. And I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to try to spin it so that we can understand what he meant. See, you got to remember that in the 30s, the rise of fascism, dictators of Mussolini, whom he actually praises in this article. He doesn't mention Hitler, but this was right in the midst of Hitler's election and so on. We had World War I and just a lot of turmoil, and the hyperinflation of Germany We had labor unrest in America. We had already had the Bolshevik Revolution. Democracy was on the ropes in certain respects. Germany, the rise of Hitler had shown the weaknesses of democracy, not unlike what we have seen in the past few years, which is partly why I read this. But more is coming, so hang in there. Question: will the economic, political, social, religious, and educational revolutions and transitions now being experienced by most major nations result in cultural retrogression, or in intellectual and spiritual expansion and greater international harmony and understanding? Interesting. Now, this is 1934. World War II hadn't happened yet. Answer: Yogananda. We may stumble on the way, we may slip backward a little, but being endowed with divine intelligence, mentally we shall be moving constantly toward the goal of truth and understanding. Every educational revolution at least shakes up the dormant souls and quickens the receptive souls and awakens in them the desire to follow the path of truth. Interesting. Question: individualism and socialism are conflicting philosophies in the modern world. Which is more likely to prevail in the future? Answer by Yogananda: individual perfection and social upliftment are interdependent. I'm going to read that again. Individual perfection and social upliftment are interdependent. Now here's where he actually praises Mussolini. I think Mussolini this was before he became warlike and wanted to recreate the Roman Empire, but in the beginning he was doing a lot of social work there in Italy and was elected, like Hitler was, but was at least elected originally to help end the chaos in Italy. Italy seems to be nothing but chaos, no matter who runs the place. But anyway, Okay, I'll move on here. He said socialism, consisting of evolved individuals, will prevail in the end. But as long as people are not highly evolved, individualism, which we can equate with egotism, will keep coming to the surface. Individualism exists only for the ushering in of spiritual socialism, in which evolved souls will live for the greatest good of the greatest number. What he's saying there is that each person, each individual has to evolve. And we evolve through certain stages, and in the stage of self-interest, which is characteristic of the age we're in, Dwapara Yuga, in the age of self-interest, we gradually grow as we satisfy our self-interest. We realize that it's not satisfying at all, and it's more satisfying to include the interests of other people. So he's saying that the awakening of the ego, the evolution of the ego, particularly during an ascendant age, moves towards a greater good for the greater number. Okay. Question: does the rise in recent years of dictatorships as forms of government indicate the failure and ultimate doom of democracy? Very interesting question. Well, listen to what he says. Answer, Yogananda: a society of morons, a society of morons and unthinking people will never establish a real democracy. I'm going to repeat that. A society of morons and unthinking people will never establish a real democracy. The average man cannot think clearly, but is ruled by explosions of his emotions. Now, hang on to your hat. He needs the master mind of a dictator in order to think right and do right. When the mass of the people in a nation are qualitatively and uniformly educated, they will form the democracy of universal wisdom and agreement and can then govern themselves spontaneously by the universal laws of truth. Now, we better look at that. Then dictators will be unnecessary. Well, first off, keep in mind that the planet as a whole, nations as a whole, was, other than America, which had established democracy first in world history, really. But most of the nations were still, in 1934, struggling with or ruled by royalty, monarchy, aristocracy, by a strict caste system, and so forth. And as we saw in the decades that followed, like World War II, with the freedom of so many nations, it just spawned nothing but dictators. South America, Africa, Asia. It seems to be, though he doesn't quite say this, it seems to be that and we see this in a little bit in Rome, but Rome was in a descending era. But it seems that a strong leadership, call it a dictator if you want, but strong leadership is needed to bring order out of chaos. And that differs quite a bit. I mean, America is very different than Uganda or, other countries. So we each have to deal with where we are. But whereas I grew up thinking this country was a little more on top of things in terms of consciousness, it's certainly gone backwards in the last many decades towards morons and unthinking people. And the nation as a whole has had an instinct to draw to its leadership a dictator. I mean, who can deny it? And then that very dictator points at China, where there's a dictator, and says, look how efficient they are. Look how orderly society is. This is very hot and tricky stuff, folks. The other way of putting it, as I would put it, have often put it, is we get what we deserve in terms of leadership. Now listen to this. You think you've heard something. Now listen to this. One real wise dictator, like President Roosevelt, is much better than too many cooks of small dictators and politicians who spoil the broth. Then he goes on, a wholehearted cooperation with the National Recovery Administration and with active, wise President Roosevelt will bring prosperity and international balance. Democracy will never fail. It is the growing life of nations which will mature through the trials of republicanism. That's kind of aristocracy, if you will. Dictatorships, capitalism, and any other isms which are necessary for the nation's growth. Okay, well, you can swallow that and chew on it. Let's move on. Question. What effect would independence for India have on that nation's diplomatic and commercial relations with other countries? Well, by this point, that's a fact already. It was not a fact in 1934. And, of course, he goes on to say the obvious, which is that independent India will become prosperous and so forth. But I just thought, for curiosity, to read to you what he said about that question. He said, a free India will enrich the world with her agricultural and mining resources. And that if you think that's cute, listen to this. And will become prosperous herself when she uses the hoarded gold of the idle princely estates to buy agricultural and scientific machinery. And India's relations with international equality and freedom will prevent the greatest potential war between the insulted nations, dependent nations of Asia, from China, Japan, India, Egypt, and some nations of Europe, with exceptions of, interestingly, Germany, Russia, and America. Germany, Russia, and America at that point in history did not have empires like Britain or France or Belgium or Holland, you see. So Germany was late to the empire game, and so didn't really have any empire. Russia, ditto, and America just didn't. So he's holding out the prospect that India will, by virtue of its inclination to be more egalitarian in its foreign relations, as in fact it sort of was during the Cold War years after its independence. It was trying to balance Russia and America, sometimes leaning towards Russia and later leaning towards America. But it was not interested in being a pawn in the great game of the European and Western countries. And so it kind of tried to hold at bay, though, the Cold War between communism and Americanism. And overall, I'd say did a good job. But this is just a power-packed article in 1934 that he wrote. I don't know what to make of it. It doesn't really matter what I make of it. I just wanted to share it with you. Curious how you see in a person's life and in the life of a saint, of an avatar, how you cannot extricate the conditions and attitudes and cultural and historical realities of the time with the pronouncements or the views, opinions, etc. of even a great saint. He, Yogananda, of course, universalizes everything he says, which is right to do, given who he is. But at the same time, he has to deal with the reality of nations and what was happening at that time. So, very interesting. I hope you found it so as well. Okay.